Thank you very much, Gleaves. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I have to tell you that I stand somewhat in awe when I think that I'm going to tell Ralph Hollenstein about leadership. Ralph Hollenstein wrote the book on leadership a long time ago, and I am a bit intimidated at the thought that I'm going to stand up here and talk about leadership, but I'm happy to tell you about it. And what I want to do today is give you, the students, a few principles that I've picked up along the way on leadership and how it works. That's my goal, is to give you some concrete suggestions as to what you can do if you want to be a leader. Leadership as a lawyer or an academician or a teacher or a dentist or a salesman or a politician or whatever is all subject to the same basic principles. There are obviously different skills of a technical nature involved in various endeavors, but given an understanding of those skills, the principles of leadership are, in my judgment, very similar. Next year I will have practiced law in Grand Rapids for 50 years, and Gleaves mentioned whether I started with Farnham. The truth is I've been with Farnham the whole time. Now, there have been a series of mergers and changes, but essentially with that law firm. During the course of that career, I've been active in the management end of my profession as well as the community. And within my profession, I served, as Gleaves said, as managing partner or chairman of my law firm for 8 years and was a part of the management team for 14 years. I led the law firm at a time when it had 20 lawyers, and when it had 75 lawyers, and when it had 120 lawyers. At the same time, I tried to be active in the community locally. 2 years after I graduated from law school, I began serving on the board and later as president of the Grand Rapids Child Guidance Clinic, which in the 1960s was a relatively early attempt to deal with children and their psychological problems at the preschool level. I later served, as Gleaves mentioned, as chairman of the board of Blodgett, and then when they merged it into Spectrum, on the Spectrum board, and as chairman of the Spectrum board, and as a part of that process I served with Priority Health, which is a health insurance company, and served as its chairman. And I was as active, as Gleaves said, in politics as the Kent County chairman, as the 5th Congressional District chairman when Jerry Ford was the congressman, and on the Michigan Natural Resource Commission, which is an agency of state government which at that time picked the director of a major state department, the Department of Natural Resources. Now, what I've done just now is illustrate to you one of the basic principles of leadership. My assignment today is to talk to you about leadership. But personally, I don't just want to talk about leadership. I want to try to get you to accept some of my thoughts and my ideas on how you can be a leader. And I'll talk for 30 minutes or 40 minutes or something, and then I'm gone. So one of the first things I have to do if I'm going to be a leader with you today is to gain some credibility with you. You don't know me. You probably won't see me again, so the best I can do is tell you what I've done. I have to establish some credentials and hope to establish some credibility with you so you'll act on my suggestions. And that's what you, as future leaders, have to begin to do. You have to begin to build credibility with people around you and with people that you want to lead. And you have to think about that and work at it every day. And that's one of the basic principles of leadership. I learned that. Well, I'm not sure. I'll take that with a question. How I learned that, maybe I'll take that later. But I have another point to make at the beginning. Practically nothing I say today is original. Principles and approaches that I'm going to outline for you have been around for a long time, and they're easily available from books or from observing people around you who are leaders. And any of you who care to can go to the books and watch the people and pick them up. They're all basic principles, and you can translate them into action. And of course, there are talents or attributes as being part of a good leader that they may be born with. And those talents make it easier for some people, probably for all people in one way or another, to develop leadership attributes in some categories, and maybe it's easier in some ways than others. And you and I may have negatives that you're born with, that it's difficult to get over and to pick up the leadership attributes to get around them. But every one of the leadership talents or attributes, whether good or bad, can be augmented or mitigated by the skills in leadership that you learn and put to use. Every leadership principle can be improved upon by you. So whatever you're born with or you aren't born with, you can make it better. Maybe you can't. Maybe if you're a baseball player, you got eyes that can see that ball coming to you better than others, and you can get a little better at it, but maybe you can't be Ted Williams. But with leadership, you can pick up the principles. Abraham Lincoln may have looked like an ape, gangly, not very attractive human being, and he was called an ape. You can find cartoons that picture him as an ape. He may have had a high, squeaky voice, but everybody today recognizes that he was a great leader, and his leadership skills were monumental, and he developed those skills. One of the most moving examples of that happened to me, probably 10 years ago, Connie and I went to see a prairie, a reconstructed prairie in southern Indiana, and down there we saw that the land that Lincoln had grown up on from age 6 or something to 19 was close by, so we went over there, and they had a big museum and all sorts of things, and we went to that, and it was late in the day, and they set out in the woods. They had the remains of the cabin he'd grown up in it. It was late, and I really wasn't very much interested in looking at the remains of a cabin. But Connie urged me, my wife, to go see it, and we went out there. And they had the ruins of the cabin, and then they had a model reconstructed. And I stood there in the reconstructed model and looked at the ruins of the cabin, and I don't remember the exact dimensions, but I can tell you, if you start at that wall and come over to about where I am and go back to this wall, that's about the size of it. I mean, it's tiny. And in the cabin is a fireplace on this wall, and a double bed, which was the double bed that size, and a table where everybody ate. So you had his parents had a place to sleep, you had a table where they ate, you had the fireplace, and that about took up the cabin. And upstairs there was a loft where the 3 kids slept. And I stood there and looked at that cabin, and all I could think of was the Lincoln Memorial. All I could see is Abraham Lincoln sitting on that big chair of marble looking down the mall, and all I could think of was from here to there. How did that, how did that happen? And that's my example for you today. You can learn, you can pick up leadership talents. You can learn to be a leader, and everybody recognizes he was one of the best, and that's where he started, in that little cabin. So let's talk about some of the things you need to do if you want to be a leader. First, you have to know who you are and what you want to achieve. Knowing who you are is essentially knowing and molding your own character. Who are you and what do you want to be? Stephen Covey, who wrote the famous and very readable treatise that's been on the bestseller list for, I think, 10 years, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, starts there. Begin with the end in mind. That's the principle. Start knowing your goal. Let me quote, "The most effective way I know to begin with the end in mind is to develop a personal mission statement, a philosophy or creed that focuses on what you want to be, what you want your character to be, and what you want to do, what your contributions and our achievements are, and the values and principles that those are based on." So first, what do you want to be? What's your mission? Who are you? What do you like? What don't you like? I'm sure, I know what you want to be sounds pretty intimidating, and when I use the word mission statement, that sounds pretty intimidating, but you think about it. You spend a lot of time thinking about who you are, and you can refine that and develop it and figure out what you want to be. Do you want to be a friend? Do you want to be a follower in most things? Or do you want to be a leader in everything? Do you want to be tactful? Are you willing to bend? Do you like to bend? What are your instincts? What's your mission? You need to understand all of these things. A good example is, are you a risk taker? Some people just love to gamble. They love it. They get their kicks out of it. There's nothing wrong with gambling if you can afford it, or you can, if money's involved, or gambling in anything. If you can live with it, if you like to do it, you can gamble in anything if you can live with the results. But if that's a beautiful example of saying your need is to understand yourself. If you're a risk taker and you want to be a leader, then you need to understand that maybe you're willing to take more risks than the people around you. And if you're going to lead them, you have to understand what the limits are to your gamble and your risk taking. And maybe you have to modify what you do yourself. So you have to understand yourself and know who you are and what you want to be and how that plays into everything you're going to lead. Secondly, you have to know what you want to achieve. You have to have some goals. If you want to be a leader, you can't just thrash around living from day to day. You have to know what you want to achieve, and that goes for anything. If you don't want to be the president, or if you do, if you want to be the governor, or you want to be a leader in anything you want to do. As a student, what do you want to achieve? Who am I first, and how do I work? And secondly, what do I want to achieve? Do I want an A in that history course? And if so, if that's my goal, then I have to go get it. Then I have to go after it, and I have to mold what I do to what I want to achieve. One instance that I love to use with leadership that I think some people don't think about, and my guess is that that's another issue, but my guess is that young people don't, at your age, think about. But there's a leadership role that most of you will probably have, and that's as a parent. That's a big-time leadership role, and that's a big-time leadership role. And you have to begin with the end in mind. What do you want for your kids? What do you want them to be? Because you're going to have a lot to do with it. You're going to lead them for a number of years. What is your goal? Perhaps you know your daughter is high-spirited and high-strung, and you know that may get her in trouble, but you don't want to quash that spirit, and you don't think you ought to anyway. On the other hand, you don't want that independent, high-spirited young woman to get in trouble, and you've got to figure out how to work her through that without running your thumb over her and killing the spirit and driving her into the ground. It's easy to say yes, but sometimes you have to say no. If you're going to mold that character, if you're going to be a leader, and believe me, this is a leadership job most of us aren't very well prepared for. Most people I know struggle with it, but it's a prime example of leadership. Now, as I've indicated, you cannot lead unless you understand yourself. You can't jump into public leadership, to leading out there, or effective leadership without some personal maturity and strength of character to deal with others. Again, as Stephen Covey puts it, and I quote, "You can't be successful with other people if you haven't paid the price of success with yourself." So armed with the understanding of who you are and your character and what you want to achieve and what you want to do, then you can turn out there to what you want to lead. And that gets us to another fundamental principle. If you're going to be a leader, you have to understand the people you're trying to lead. Again, as Stephen Covey put it, first understand, then be understood. You have to get into another person's frame of reference if you're going to be a leader. This is a story, another story that I can use for lots of things. But I think it's a great story that illustrates you have to know what's going on with the people you're trying to lead. And it's like I said at the beginning, nothing I've got to say is original. It all came from someplace else. But man's on a subway in New York, up high in the 80s or the 90s on a Sunday morning, and there aren't very many people on the subway. Maybe it's a third full, and it's pretty quiet. It's Sunday morning. I think it's 9 or 10 o'clock, and people are riding along, and everybody's tired on Sunday. It's not like the hustle and bustle of the subway in the middle of the week. It's, you know, it's pretty quiet. Some people reading newspapers and doing other things, and most people not wanting to deal with anything. It's Sunday. It's just kind of relaxed. And all of a sudden, a guy gets on with 5 kids. And they're all under 10. And they all sit down, and instantly they're up. And they're all over the subway car. And they're running up and down and hollering and yelling, and everybody that's on the subway just, you know, they just don't want to deal with it. And the kids are even knocking people's newspapers down, and they're doing what kids do. And finally one guy thinks, you know, I'm not going to let that father get away with that. I'm going to tell him. He's got to get his kids under control. So he goes back to where the father is sitting quietly, just kind of, the father's kind of observing it. And he says to the guys, he sits down, you know, your kids are totally unruly, and they're this place is chaos with them. The father says, yeah, you know, I know that. And he says, I don't really know what to do about it. We just left the hospital and their mother died. Now that's a perfect example of, unless you know what's going on with the people you're trying to lead, you can't very well do it. That changed the whole frame of reference right there. People take a different, everybody takes a different approach. But it is a perfect example. You have to get into another person's frame of reference if you're going to lead them. You have to know what the person or group you're trying to lead desires or thinks or believes. You need to understand them and their needs, and then you can begin to lead them where you're trying to go. If you understand what people want and why they want it, then you can figure out whether you can offer it to them, whether you can lead them or where you want to go. If there are problems with their assumptions, or if they don't really understand why they want it, you can begin to discuss that with them. But if you simply start with your own agenda that you want to sell, you're not going anyplace. You're not going anyplace because you don't understand where they're coming from. First understand, then be understood. And it's not just because you want to be sure what the crowd wants. You know, there's an old idea that floats around that there are some leaders that figure out where the body politic or whatever is going, and then they run around and get in front of them. That's not my point. That's not what I'm talking about. My point is that when you start with your own agenda, what it is you want to accomplish as you lead, or before you lead, you have to understand the people you're dealing with and trying to lead and what their motivations and desires are, or you'll never do a very good job. One of the most difficult problems I faced in my law firm as managing partner was taking in new partners. From time to time, in order to grow a law partnership, make it an ongoing entity and an institution, and the one I'm with is an institution and it's been around for 120 years, the partnership has to take in younger people and has to make them partners. The problem is, or was for me, that if you have 30 or 40 partners, they're all going to vote on who comes into the partnership. And if you've got 30 or 40 people voting, they probably have got 20 different ideas on what the characteristics ought to be of a potential partner. Partnership to lawyers, at least in this town, in this area, it's a mystical process. I mean, it's a lifetime bond, and it doesn't always work that way, but an awful lot of people, they hire on for life, and they become partners for life. And taking in new people is a tough job. It's a very complex issue. Some people think that whoever you take in as a partner ought to be like them. Some people think they ought to have different skills, different talents. Some people are afraid of the future because they look at somebody and say, you know, how are those people going to fit in 20 years from now? Some people are worried about the values of an incoming partner in the long term and how those values will fit. But every current partner gets a vote. In our case, we had to have an 80% vote. Now, if you think it's easy to get 80% of a group of lawyers to agree on anything, you don't understand. That's tough, and that's a major leadership job. If you're the leader of the law firm, and if the goal is that for the ongoing viability of the partnership, you have to take in 1 or 2 or 5 partners, if that's a goal you're committed to, and you think it ought to happen for the benefit of the law firm, then somehow you have to synthesize all of those different concepts, and then you have to turn to the people that are the candidates that might be the partners, and you have to make them fit together so that you come up with your 80% vote. That's a perfect example of how a leader can't just have a program that he or she wants to convince people to adopt. There's no way you can do that if you don't understand the voters, the partners, and what they wanted. And only after the leader understands what the rest of the partners want can he or she then begin to focus on the individual candidates and determine whether or not they have the qualities that the leader thinks the partnership needs and that you can fit together with them, and whether you can convince the rest of the partners to take them in. And I'm sure that that process and that principle you can describe various places in various different contexts. I'm talking about the leadership principle: first understand, then be understood. That is a skill lawyers particularly need. It's also, if you think about it, a skill, a necessary skill, that puts me, again, at a disadvantage today as I stand here trying to sell you on the principles of leadership that I think you ought to pay attention to. Because I really don't understand you, I don't understand your culture, or how you think, or I just don't understand. I raised a couple of sons that are now entering middle age, but I don't really have a feel for you. So as I speak here on leadership, I can't come forward with that side of the bargain because I don't really know you. Another good example of the principles that I've been enunciating is in the Doris Kearns Goodwin book, Team of Rivals, about how Abraham Lincoln put a cabinet together made up of people who'd run against him for the presidency. That book and that concept is kind of in vogue today because our President-elect Obama is doing some of that, bringing in rivals and putting them in a cabinet. And Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote this really wonderful story of how Lincoln put together a cabinet of people who I'd call them arch enemies, some of them anyway, all of whom expected they were going to be the president, and many of whom had reason to believe they would be, but he won. And then he puts them together and makes them a cabinet to run. The particular story that I picked out to illustrate what I'm telling you today, the Secretary of the Treasury was a man by the name of Salmon P. Chase. Great name, isn't it? Salmon P. Chase. First time I ever ran across it, I was working at a bank here when I was in college, and the guy came to show me. I was in college, as I said, in college. He said, Salmon P. Chase's picture is on the $10,000 bill. You don't very often see a $10,000 bill, but that Salmon P. Chase's picture's on it. First time I ever heard that name, and I never forgot it. Anyway, in 1864, Salmon P. Chase acted like and did some things that looked like he was going to run against Lincoln in 1864 when Lincoln was running for a second term. Here he's the Secretary of the Treasury. He's worked with Lincoln for 4 years as a part of Lincoln's cabinet, and now Chase is making moves and writing letters and doing things in a position to run against Lincoln for a second term nomination. Lincoln knew what Chase was doing, but he just let him do it. He even informed Chase that a circular that Chase had distributed pushing Chase's candidacy had not surprised him. He said, you know, I had knowledge that you were doing that and that there were people out there working for you. And he told Chase he didn't intend to hold him responsible. Now think of it. Just think about that. You're in the middle of a civil war. I mean, this is big time crisis. And Chase is the guy who's been the Secretary of Treasury who was financing that war and incidentally doing a good job of it, putting together the programs that under very difficult circumstances that are financing the war. And he's absolutely disloyal to his boss and trying to supplant him. And Lincoln knew it. And he doesn't even tell him he's holding him responsible for the action. In the end, it all worked out to Lincoln's advantage because Chase couldn't beat him. He couldn't get Lincoln off the ticket. Chase couldn't put together the support of the people that he needed to run against him, and Lincoln still kept him in the cabinet to do the job he'd done in many respects pretty well. Here's, I mean, it's just an incredible leadership feat. Here's Doris Goodman's quote in the aftermath of it. Discipline and keen insight. What's keen insight? First understand, then be understood. Discipline and keen insight had once again served Lincoln most effectively by regulating his emotions, resisting the impulse to strike back at Chase when the circular first became known. He'd gained time for his friends to mobilize the massive latent support for his, Lincoln's, candidacy. Chase's aspirations were crushed without Lincoln's direct intrusion. He'd known all along that his Treasury Secretary was no innocent, but by seeming to accept Chase's word, he allowed the Secretary to retain some measure of his dignity. At the same time, the country retained Chase's services in the cabinet. Again, I'm reading from Doris Goodwin, and this is the last sentence. She says, Lincoln himself would determine the appropriate time for Chase's departure. Now, all the principles that I've been outlining are in that little incident and in Goodwin's narrative. Lincoln understood himself. He knew that everybody else, any normal human being, would have cut Chase's legs off. I mean, most people wouldn't even think about it. With this kind of disloyalty at the highest level of the government, Lincoln knew how he felt about the matter and about Chase. He knew himself very well, but he had discipline. He knew what Chase thought. He knew what Chase was doing. He knew why Chase wanted to be president. He knew all about that. In fact, he knew why Chase was running so hard. It was unbridled ambition. Chase had always had it. Chase desperately wanted to be president, so much so he couldn't help himself. On the other hand, Lincoln knew that he had friends who would, as Doris Goodwin put it, crush. I love the word crush Chase, and they did. They crushed his nomination. And Lincoln wanted Chase around because he'd done a good job. He knew he had to retain his dignity. It's a masterful stroke of leadership. I submit to you, as I did at the beginning, that all the principles are the same. Know yourself, know what you want to achieve, know the other person or people you're dealing with, and what they're all about and why. I want to give you a little pithier example, one that's a little more down to earth, but it's all the same principles. Let me tell you about Jerry Ford's admonition, Jerry Ford's mother's admonition to him. He said that his mother always told him there were only 3 rules in the household for the children. 1, work hard. 2, tell the truth. And 3, get to dinner on time. Now, lots of ways that says it all. That says it all. Work hard. Work. I've given you a lot of things to work on. Work hard. Do it. Go at it. Give it your diligence. Everything you've got, give it to it. Second one, tell the truth is obvious. You won't have any credibility if you don't tell the truth. Build a reputation for telling the truth. Gosh knows if you live in this town, Jerry Ford had that, the ultimate. He told the truth. Build a reputation for that. And if you think about what Dorothy Ford said, and the quote that I read you from Goodwin about Lincoln, he told the truth all along. He'd let Chase know he'd known what he was doing behind his back as Chase was trying to knife him. He also said he understood it. Lincoln understood what he was doing. And if you think about it, who comes out the winner? Chase was trying to tell Lincoln that he didn't know anything about it. Chase said he didn't do anything with it. It wasn't him. He wasn't the winner, because that just doesn't sell. You have to tell the truth. But you don't have to cram it down the next guy's throat. When you speak, you have to tell the truth, and people have to know you do it. And that's obvious. That gets us all into trouble if we try not to. And the third rule is one I really like: get to dinner on time. Now, what's that? That's commitment. That's commitment. If you're part of this family and the family sits down for dinner at a set time, be there. You're part of the family. And that doesn't have anything to do with dinner, as a matter of fact. It has to do with commitment to the cause. Whatever organization or society, whatever it is, be committed. Do it right. I want to talk a little bit about one other idea. I've given you what I think are the basic principles, but there's one that I can't resist picking out as another thing that you have to be conscious of, because I think it too is sometimes little understood, and that's symbolism. One of the things, if you're going to be a leader, that you have to be constantly cognizant of is symbolism. Symbolism is the practice of representing things by symbols, or investing things with a symbolic meaning or character. According to Webster, a symbol is something used or regarded as standing for or representing something else. A material object representing something immaterial. An emblem, a token, a sign. And good leaders use symbols all the time. All the time. We had now deceased in this town a man by the name of Dick Gillette. If you walk across the river in front of the Ford Museum, if you look on the side, that bridge is named after him. It's the Gillette Bridge, what we all call the old interurban bridge, but it's the Gillette Bridge. Dick Gillette was the president of the old Kent Bank then, and was a real leader in this town. Most of the time behind the scenes. I mean, he didn't make a big deal out of the fact that he was a leader. And one day I sat at a table in the basement of the University Club, where a bunch of business people sit, a big round table. It's still there in the corner where people just sit down and eat. And it was in the 1970s, I think, and the table was full of people, and Dick Gillette was there, and in the Civic Auditorium, which is right across the river, the big stone building that's now part of the whole DeVos complex. That was built in the 30s as an auditorium, and they needed to do some work on it. It's since been revamped, but the front of it's still the same, still the marble front. And the community was trying to figure out what to do about it, and they'd had a vote and the taxpayers wouldn't pay to revamp it. And it is the 70s, and economically we're in one of our Michigan recessions. The automobile industry is in trouble, and these people are just sitting around the table talking about the Civic Auditorium, and now that the voters have voted it down, what are they going to do? How are they going to solve that problem? And Dick Gillette says to the group, we have to get a crane in the air. And everybody kind of looks at him and wonders why, and he says, look, Grand Rapids, the expressways come down here and intersect. Everybody in Grand Rapids drives through that sooner or later, some more than others. All kinds of visitors drive through that. Michigan's in terrible shape economically. We're doing better in Grand Rapids, but we have to demonstrate that. We get a crane in the air and we'll show everybody that we're going in Grand Rapids, we're moving, we're getting things done. And I've never forgotten it. I thought, what? Now there's a guy that understood symbols. We have to get a crane in the air. We have to get it in there because it'll demonstrate what this community is. I contrast that And I told them at the table, I decided you can't help but look at the automobile executives. I mean, what were they thinking about? They're going to ask the government for $50 million and they fly 3 private jets. I don't even blame them. They're so far into working. But the people are, I mean, you know, they probably didn't even think about it. Obviously they didn't. But the PR people, I mean, it was such a foolish thing to do. And in the long run, in terms of what they're playing for, it doesn't, not doing it wouldn't save all that much money in terms of the dollars they're playing for. But it was, they absolutely misused the symbol. They created a symbol. And that's why I'm saying leaders have to think about symbols. They have to pay attention to what they do and how they do it and the symbolic nature of everything they do. Now let me conclude just with a few thoughts about your opportunity. You know, I think you young people, you Leadership Academy people, are in a wonderful position. I really do. This American society and culture has been built over 200 years, and it's consistently grown better and become better educated. Technological advances are unbelievable. I'm just nothing but optimistic about what is ahead of you and what you've got, your future. I envy young people, I really do, and what's ahead of you. Sure, there are problems. There are a lot of problems. But if you want to look at history, look at the last century. There were horrendous problems. When I was 10, the world was in the midst of the greatest war in history. 80+ million people died. 80 million. People don't focus on that. Western civilization literally hung in the balance. That didn't matter. The American culture, society, and lots of other things, but America was up to the challenge, and I think today you're in an even better position than we were then. America and its people, you, are up to the challenges. I'm mindful of Dwight Eisenhower with an incident that I saw on television in the early days of television. It was in a press conference. I know it was in 1956, and I think it was just after he'd won the Pennsylvania primary. The Pennsylvania had a presidential primary then. And he'd already been president for 4 years, and they were putting his name on the primary ballot, and he won big. I mean, everybody wanted him. And he stood at that press conference, and some reporter gets up and says, "Mr. Eisenhower, what do you want out of life? I mean, you've done it all. You've led the greatest army the world has ever seen. You've led a great university, that was Columbia University, and you've been president of the United States for 4 years, and now you have the people telling you they want you to be president again. Is there anything more you want out of life?" And he didn't hesitate a second. He said, "Oh yes, there is. You know, I look at my grandson David, who I think was then 5, and he said, I'd love to be David. I'd love to start all over again." That's the way I feel about the opportunity you have. I think you, your generation, your age group, has tremendous opportunity. I have no doubt that you'll meet the challenges, and I have no doubt that this country, the world, will meet the challenges, and America will lead, and I think it's just go to it. I envy you. I think that you are the people who are going to be the leaders in this century, and that's the best I can say. Go to it. Thank you.
gentlemen field questions?
Sure.
Anybody have any questions?
Back there.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I
Thank you.
have a question, and I've been thinking about throughout these lunches what it looks like to learn from failure, to learn from mistakes. I'm wondering, in your experience, what are either traits in leadership or experiences that we can learn to avoid so we don't repeat those same mistakes? You mentioned several, characteristics of effective leaders. What are several traits of things we should recognize in ourselves or in our organizations that will lead to being ineffective or failing? Is there anything that sticks out in your mind, or advice you can offer us and things to avoid?
Well, obviously you can learn from mistakes. You can. Sometimes I think we learn more from our own than we do from other people's. But yeah, you can learn from mistakes. If I don't think of anything off the top of my head. I mean, it's easy to look. People know a lot more about this than I do, but look at the leadership that got us into the Vietnam War and the mistakes they made, and they thought they were doing it the right way, and they thought they were following up World War II. But I'm not enough of a scholar to know about that. But it's obvious. Yeah, you ought to be. I mean, maybe the automobile executives are a good example. Think about it before you start asking for money and then doing dumb things. Yes, sir.
One of the major themes he talked about was getting to know the people that you lead and having them get to know you. In education, we call that building community.
Yep.
What are some of the things that you've seen people use to build community in the organizations that you've been in? What are some of the steps you take proactively to build community?
Well, I told Brian. Where is Brian? Brian, back here. I told him before the meeting. Brian works, I think he's second under Gleaves, isn't he? He's second in command in the office. And Brian will tell you every time the Hauenstein Center gets together, I mean, he's young. To me, he's young. He's really young. And every time we get together for a Hauenstein meeting, I go out of my way to find Brian, and he'll tell you I do that too. I always find him because I'm interested in what he thinks. I'm interested in what he knows and what his outlook is. And I think you need to find ways. In the office, in the Barnum law firm, there are all kinds of young people, and I try to pick out a few, and because I'm interested in knowing what they think. It's the interpersonal skills, building relationships. I'm sure in education they tell you a lot about that, and you have to work at it. And but the principle is the same whether it's your child or the local education group or whatever. It's just try to understand. And I still think my example on the subway is as good as you get. I mean, without knowing where that poor guy was coming from, how could you lead him to take care of his kid? You couldn't. I mean, you changed the whole course of the conversation, and that's the extreme. But you have to do the best you can to get close to people or ideas or whatever. I'm happy to expound. Well, I'm laughing at me now, but I'm happy to talk about one of the things I think I find in this society at this time, all the time, is that I don't think anybody, too strong, I don't think many people pay any attention to the point of view of the other side. I mean, they don't even want to know. In the presidential campaign, the perfect example was the battle that first Hilary Clinton and Barack Obama had going, and then Barack Obama and John McCain on pre-negotiations. I mean, they talked about it ad infinitum. Whether you should, Mr. Obama, President-elect Obama's position is, no, I'll negotiate with anybody. I'll go any place and talk anytime. And that's so eminently reasonable that people say, well, yeah, I mean, what kind of idiot wouldn't do that? I mean, you're the leader of the free world, why wouldn't you do that? Well, if you get beneath that, to the other side of the coin, the Hillary Clinton position, and then John McCain's position, there's a long history in American foreign policy of our leaders getting into trouble when they just went out and lent their credibility to everybody, anybody in the country, and you can build the whole case that you know, Iran's probably the great example right now. If you want to go talk to Ahmadinejad or whatever, I'm not sure I pronounced that right, but if you want to go talk to him, he wants you for a PR reason on his own part. He wants to demonstrate what he's got, and you need to study that and analyze it and figure it out. But my point of the whole discussion is that the one position is so eminently reasonable that nobody pay any attention to the other one. As far as I could see, it's a little more complicated and sophisticated, and I think that's true all through the society. Nobody pays any attention to the other side. They don't. You have to pick one, but you really ought to understand them.
Well, thank you very much.